Hey there, friends. Dave Paulides, CanAm Missing Project, copyrighted edition for our video channel. Thank you for being here. And this is a missing person segment. And we're going to talk about one specific case, and then I'm going to read you a story from my book, Missing 411 Hunters. And this all is about Australia. I'm constantly amused that people will stumble onto our show and make comments about how insane and stupid my ideas are. Well, since I really don't put out any ideas, I'm not sure what they're referring to, but I always ask people when they make a comment that seems a little off course to please watch my 3 movies. It's almost impossible to get anybody to read a book these days. For some reason, I don't know why. But people will watch a movie, especially if it has good ratings, and I'm blessed that my 3 documentaries have good ratings. And you can watch them for free on Tubi, T-U-B-I. You go there, Missing 411, Missing 411 The Hunted, and Missing 411 The UFO Connection. All are free to watch. Please pass the link on. It would help us immensely if people watched it. And the reason I ask them to watch is I want to break that mold that many people have. I want to get a little crack in that outer lining that this world is as boring and as mundane as some people think. You see, one of the things that's been shown to me is that what we can see with our own eyes at day and night is only a small fraction of what's happening in our world at any one time. All you have to do is, number 1, look through night vision. Number 2, look through FLIR. And it's instantaneous. You'll be stunned what we're missing. But there's probably other things that are running parallel to us in our dimension that we just can't see. I always talk about Huck sitting out in our hallway looking at the kitchen and jumping up and getting in a growl position and looking at something that I can't see. But something alerted her, and her senses are far more acute than mine are. Just an example. Now, several years ago, when I first wrote the book Missing 411 Hunters, there's a story about Australia and a lawman from Australia that stumbled into an event. It's not a long story, but it sets you up for the missing person story I'm going to tell you about. This is on page 390, Missing 411 Hunters. Miami. In 1898, there was a sergeant employed by the New South Wales Police Mounted Unit named W.G. Noble. His job was to travel to out-of-the-way locations and keep the peace. One of his keys to survival was to make friends with Aboriginal tribes and to keep up communications between his organization and tribal activities. In 1899, Noble wrote in an article titled, quote, "Hunter Vanished in a Storm," end quotes. The story was published again November 26, 1949, in the edition of the Sydney Morning Herald. Noble was riding in 115-degree heat and felt as though he was melting. He rode into an area named near Lake Booroolilla, Booroolilla, to investigate, as he described, quote, the mysterious disappearance of dead wool during the devastating drought of 1898. He also was in the area to investigate rustlers. He stated that he was riding when banks of heavy clouds loomed over the Bellar and Coolabah forests beyond the Spinifex and Marilla ridges. There were ominous rolls of distant thunder. Anyone who has read my books knows that bad weather is involved in many of the disappearances of people. Sometimes it appears just as the disappearance occurs, sometimes just after. Noble had 15 miles to travel until he reached his destination. He decided to stop at an Aboriginal camp to get cover. He described the location as the, quote, pine woods on the shores of a stretch of water known to the natives as Lake Barilla. The sergeant described a chaotic scene at the camp. He stated the area was in extreme turmoil. Dogs were yelping, women were running and shouting. It looked like complete chaos. As soon as he dismounted his horse, he was waved over to a dander and told to take cover inside by the chief. It was large enough inside for him and his horse. Just as he escaped inside, the storm cut loose. Almost non-stop lightning, thunder, rain, hail. It seemed as though the weather gods had gotten angry and were unleashing a torrent on the small camp. I will now quote the sergeant's article directly, as the wording is important. Quote, at some time when I looked out for some sign of the storm abating, I saw to my amazement a towering old warrior with long gray hair and beard standing towards the lake, on the shores of which he stood and gesticulated fiercely with his wizened arms. Then he began to chant in his deep, booming voice as though challenging the elements to mortal combat. Even while I watched, a blinding flash of lightning struck down. It left a dense, vapor-like mist which completely enveloped the warrior and hid him from view. After it lifted, I hurried over and was astounded to find he had disappeared. Later in the article was this, quote, the chief told me that the old warrior I had seen was a great hunter named Bayami the Mighty. Just as Bayami vanished, the camp began a death chant. The sergeant described the chant as eerie and poignant, that it haunted me. The article ended. 50 years later, the sergeant added this. Although half a century has rolled by, the death chant to which I listened was undoubtedly voiced during a big storm by a Burra tribe of Aborigines, which then inhabited the area around Angladal, Lightning Ridge, and the Naran River and its lakes along the Queensland border. We never found the body of the old man, and as a result, the tribe was confirmed in its belief that he had been wafted off the earth by unfriendly spirits. End of quote. I don't really care what many of you think. If you think I'm just adding this as fluff, I go on. This is fascinating first-hand account of something very unusual. The behavior of the village before the disappearance and its behavior after are truly unique. Aborigines from Australia, Native Americans from the US, and First Nations of Canada have beliefs and stories that have been carried for centuries. They each have lived in the wildest of locations of their respective areas. They have seen and experienced things that people in the city will never experience and may never comprehend. Many individuals refuse to even entertain the legends that these people carry. Here we have an educated white man from civilization that was able to view something rarely, if ever, seen by a city dweller. The event that was just described can add some light to what I've documented in 5 books. Up to this point, I'd only written 12 now. I've stated that many disappearances are related to water. Bayami vanished on the banks of a lake. I've also stated that bad weather is associated with disappearances. The warrior vanished during a horrific storm in the presence of others. The description of a mist that enveloped the area as Bayami disappeared almost seems like a magic trick seen in Las Vegas. This is the closest incident I have ever found where someone described another disappearing in the bush. If you are new to this topic, you may brush this off as another bizarre story that is probably fictional. Because of the facts involved and the manner it evolved, I believe it. Australia and North America have facts associated with disappearances that are almost identical. I've written 15 cases in Australia before this book. Those cases are documented in Missing 411 North America and Beyond, Missing 411 The Devil's in the Detail. Many of the stories involve small children that disappear from a remote spot and are found phenomenal distances from the point last seen. These are distances that make the trip seem to many readers to be supernatural. It is extremely rare in my research to document an incident when someone related to law enforcement vanishes. It may be the training and care that goes into their professional life carries over into their private life. It may be that most in law enforcement need to have a high level of common sense, something that can save your life in a challenging environment. I realize that there must be dozens of stories of lost hunters in Australia. Unfortunately, I could not find them. But I did find a few, and they're listed in the Hunter's Book. And why did I read that to you? Number one, I don't believe this is isolated. I just believe that this was observed by several, including someone from outside the tribe, meaning the sergeant. And just because he was educated, he could write, we were able to read it. So what did we observe? Was that the opening of a portal? Was that multi-dimensions coming together? I don't know, but I've told you before about an incident where a hunter was walking through high elevation in Colorado and saw a mist barrier in front of him on the trail. Just like a solid mist, he couldn't see into it. Looked like kind of fog. Told me that he walked up to it and just something told him not to walk into it, even though the trail continued supposedly into it. Said he reached up and stood on one foot and put the other foot through. He said it disappeared. And he said that was it. He turned around and ski-daddled out of there. Our world is much different than many of you believe. It's much more complex. As I've gotten older and I've gotten a circle of brilliant people, 10 times smarter than me, that are willing to talk to me and explain this world, it's because of those people I feel blessed. I'm not sure my mind would have opened enough to really comprehend what's happening here. But this next story kind of brings it home. And I've never heard of this before until someone in the community, in our village, wrote this to me. And I'm very grateful. Thank you for sending me the story. They sent me one article. I was able to find 14 about this event, which made it much clearer about what happened. This is called the Yelbeen Mystery. Western Australia. Yelbeeni, Y-E-L-B-E-N-I, is a small establishment near Training, 138 miles east of Perth. It was established in 1912 as a result of construction of a railway project which passed through the area. Yelbeeni is named after a nearby watering hole, the Yelbeen Hole well. When the town site was planned, the town was spelled Yelbeen, but was changed to match the rules of the Aboriginal pronunciation. The area is known for growing grain and has silos. So the Yelbeen Mystery, in today's terms, happened in Yelbeeni. But in 1911, it was called throughout Australia, the Yelbeen Mystery. The story surrounds a young boy named Robert Bruce McCracken, 21 months old, missing November 10th, 1911. His dad, Mr. McCracken, worked for the previous 6 months on the farm of a man named R.D. Jones in Yelbeen, who had wheat fields. Well, Mr. McCracken now had the ability, instead of traveling back and forth on weekends and things to see his family, he now had the ability to bring his family out to Yelbeen to work with him, or to be with him. Now, the family included his wife, a son 3 years old, a son 21 months old, Robert, and a baby just 9 weeks old. And on November 9th, the McCrackens left Perth for the trip to Yelbeen. They made a stop along the way for a couple hours, and they ended up getting into their house at about 2 a.m. on November 10th. 7 a.m. that day, Robert woke up with Mr. and Mrs. McCracken. Mr. McCracken had to go into work. So it was Mrs. McCracken and Robert, 21 months old. Robert wanted to go out and play, and she let him. At about 8:30 in the morning, she went out to check on him, and she saw him playing with a chain near some small construction that was going on at the farm, very near their house. It was getting warm, and you know in Australia it gets really hot. She called him in because she wanted to put a hat on him so he wouldn't get burned. He had fair skin, blonde hair. And he said, he looked at her and acknowledged and was coming that direction. She walked into the house for 3 minutes, came back, he was gone. You got to understand something. In this area at this time, there's almost nobody for miles. There's the farmer, there's Mr. McCracken, and them on the farm. That's it. Now, miles away, there were other properties and things, other farms, other people. Well, Mrs. McCracken called for her son, and almost instantly in return, she heard a scream of her son that she recognized. She could tell from the scream where it was, not that far, ran to the spot, and she couldn't believe it. Nobody was there. She called again, nothing. She started to get hysterical. She ran around looking, screaming, yelling. Nothing. At 9 a.m., a local constable was coming through the area and helped in the search and then helped organize more people to search. They got word to Mr. McCracken, who was out in the fields, and at 11 a.m. he returned and started to search as well. Now imagine this, and this is important. I've told you before that children tend to disappear from residences when the dad isn't around. I really can't explain that. Mr. McCracken wasn't there. Point of separation. Mrs. McCracken comes in the house, boy's left alone, something happened. Mrs. McCracken gave this description of her son. He had grayish blue eyes, white hair. She described her own son as very fat. Well, that's probably a pretty healthy 21-month-old. He's wearing a very light, not light colored, but a very light brown coat, leather belt, boots, and socks. She just said that he had very little to eat, and she did not believe he could travel very far. Quickly, the greater area of Yelbeen heard about this and started to respond. Now again, this community, even today, is remote. Back in 1911, this was really remote. So here's Perth. And this is Yelbeen. Right now, there's nothing out there, folks. In 1911, there was really nothing out there. So the father gets home, mother's there, other people are coming. The person who owned the farm was there, and they quickly get a dozen people out searching and looking. The next day, everybody hears. They search into the night, that first night, nothing. November 11th, they had 100 searchers on scene in the area. And they had already requested a special constable that had more experience. He was en route. They searched for 14 hours that day. They looked everywhere, called his name, expecting a response. They were getting nothing. November 12th, 150 searchers. The area was covered multiple times by search teams. Again, they weren't searching very far because, like the mother and the father have said, he couldn't go far. He was too young. And then the big breakthrough came. November 13th, the constable with extreme experience arrived, along with two of the best Aboriginal trackers in Western Australia. They came from Northam. They also brought with them a group of equestrian searchers. So they had 150 normal searchers and 25 equestrians. Let me be absolutely clear about this. Aboriginal trackers, First Nation trackers, are some of the best trackers in the world, bar none. These people know what they're looking for. And I don't care what you want to call it, special senses, whatever, they've got some special abilities. Now, the Aboriginal trackers were able to follow small footprints outside of the general area where everybody was looking. And they followed these small little tracks that they thought were Robert's right up to a wheat field. And then one of the trackers looked at the other and yelled at the other searchers, "Somebody picked him up right here." But there's no new tracks to indicate the entry of somebody else to the scene. The tracks ended, but there's no other tracks in the area of somebody picking him up. You get what I'm saying? How did the tracks magically end? So the tracks stopped. No other tracks in the area. At the time when this came out, many people, namely reporters, questioned the veracity of the trackers. And then every searcher in that community jumped up and defended these black Aboriginal trackers and stated that everyone knew they were absolutely correct when they looked at it. Now at this point, I'm thinking, okay, the tracks stop. What about the scream the mom heard? Well, from what I understand, that was very close to the house. It's a confusing scene at best. In articles after November 13th, and the search went on for 6 days, other searchers were interviewed and they said they were 100% positive the trackers were right. That was Robert's track, and it ended in the middle of nowhere. Now at the time, Australian police had a criminal investigation division, CID, and they requested to come into the search. Reporters and others at the time stated that a half-mile from the home was a thicket that was extremely difficult for an adult to even penetrate. But searchers were able to comb that area shoulder to shoulder for miles. They also said that flies in the area were horrific, to the point if there was a boy walking into that area, he'd have to close his eyes because the flies were that thick. That sounds horrific. November 17th, 1912. Now, this incident happened November 10th, 1911, so a little over a year after. There was an article in the Perth newspaper, and it was a letter from Mrs. McCracken. She was very well educated, wrote a heart-ripping message. She told the world that they had found nothing of her child. Nothing. She claimed that her boy could never have walked out of the area. Aboriginal trackers told her, "Your boy is not lost." She stated numerous times in numerous ways, "The bush did not take my child." That's what she said. Now, at the time, a year later, the Criminal Investigative Division believed Robert was still lost in the bush, even though they had no evidence. In fact, the evidence was just the opposite. And when you look into this, it's almost as though they wanted to believe this because they didn't want to do a comprehensive investigation. I hate to talk bad about the police, but I couldn't get anything more out of that than this. A month later, Mrs. McCracken writes a follow-up article to the Perth newspaper. And she said that the police told her they can't help her. And she stated that nobody is assisting the family. What are the police for? This is obscene. Now, in defense of the police, the article I read you earlier about Biami. If you were an enlightened individual and you listened intently to what searchers, the Aboriginal trackers, said, and you were enlightened, you may believe that that boy is nowhere here. And additional investigation would be worthless. So a year after he disappeared, they have nothing. I will tell you, if that body was within 1 to 2 miles of that residence, they would smell it. And they didn't. This community wasn't large enough to have somebody hiding in and around the home, waiting for this little boy to come out, waiting for the mom to go in the house and then snatch him. I'm sorry, that dog don't hunt. February 9th, 1913. A searcher who was involved in Robert's disappearance, meaning he was one of the searchers, he wrote an article to the Perth newspaper. Now, why is this ongoing? Because, friends, this was a huge mystery at the time. People read what the trackers and what the Aboriginal man said. This searcher said that the search was extremely thorough. He explained how they searched shoulder to shoulder for miles through dense brush to ensure nothing was missed. He then reiterated the accuracy of the Aboriginal tracker. And then his last words in the letter, the child was not lost. Nobody in any of the articles stated that they thought somebody from that area took their child. I couldn't find that. Many of the articles at the time classified this as the Great Yelbean Mystery. How else could it be classified? When the tracker states that the tracks stopped and there were no others around, what else could you construe from this? Realistically. And remember Biami. A cloud surrounded him and he disappeared. Maybe something highly unusual happened to Robert that made him scream. Maybe. I tend to think, based on the evidence at hand, that something we would have a difficult time understanding occurred with Robert. Namely because the remote nature of this farm, it doesn't make sense that there was somebody there. Now, I will say that in the weeks after Robert disappeared, the mom was contacted with some strange requests, saying, well, what would you think if your child was returned? And nobody ever said they had the child. Nobody asked for a reward. Nobody said they knew a kidnapper. It was just strange communications. But Mrs. McCracken was a broken lady, losing Robert. And the guilt she must have had leaving him alone for just minutes followed her for a lifetime. There's your story for today. Please share this on your social media. It would help us. I greatly appreciate you being here. Please make sure that you're subscribed and you're getting notifications. And lastly, we live in a world where it's easy to be unfriendly to people. Smiling, being polite and friendly costs nothing. And this is the kindness revolution. Let's strive to be good people and kind to others. Paulides out.